Welcome to the first ever episode of Backpost Runners. I am one of your hosts, Tim Ostlund-Foss, and as we get into the meat of the episode, I'll be joined by my co-host, Mark Kastner. In his absence, I would just like to say, abolish ICE. We're excited to join the Sounder at Heart podcast network and hope that we can expand the sorts of coverage we're able to provide at Sounder at Heart by turning the focus away from what's happening on the field week in and week out with this new show. The idea behind Backpost Runners is to create an audio magazine, something like an NPR show for soccer sickos. We'll be providing some deeply researched examinations and conversations with experts and friends from around the Seattle soccer world and beyond, looking at the culture of and around soccer in the Puget Sound, and hopefully some fun diversions as we go along. The idea is 2 to 3 segments. Typically, we're going to shoot for 15 to 30 minutes max per segment. Each segment will be its own topic, but the episodes will be grouped thematically. As an example, to get us started, we figured we'd launch with a topic that is always top of mind when we're thinking about our teams. That is, our adversaries. We'll be starting with an in-depth conversation about villains with acclaimed author and noted Sounders fan, G. Willow Wilson. After all, who better to discuss what makes a good villain, why they're important, and how MLS villains help us all to appreciate our heroes in Rave Green even more. Then Mark and I are joined by Jeff Reuter of The Guardian to talk about MLS rivalries. We'll discuss which ones have the juice and the hows and whys of their impact on the impending conference realignment coming to the league in 2027. We hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll be back soon for another episode focusing on the 2026 World Cup. Now here's the show. We are joined by renowned and award-winning author G. Willow Wilson, the creator of Miss Marvel, the series, I get it backwards every time, The Hunger in the Dusk. Is that correct?
Yep, that's it, yeah.
Fantastic. And most relevant to this conversation, currently the writer for Poison Ivy and Black Cat. To, depending on the context and circumstances, villains or anti-heroes, antagonists to some. We are going to have a conversation about MLS villains, what makes a good one, what really is a villain. Willow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
So really, the crux of this conversation depends on how you define what a villain is. In your thinking, when you approach your work, when you consume media, what is a villain? What makes a good one? And how is that different from, like I just said, an anti-hero or just an antagonist?
That's a really good question. And as I was thinking about how villains relate to conversations about sports specifically, I thought that the fun thing to think about when we talk about villains in sports is that we're really talking about villains not as some ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, a black and white way of viewing good and evil, but as someone who propels the storytelling forward. When you're writing fiction, you don't necessarily need a villain who is evil all the time. In fact, that can sometimes hamper the story. You need them to have some sort of compelling reason for doing what they do, like your Darth Vaders or your Lex Luthors. If they're just bad all the time and they kill kittens for fun, the audience never gets invested enough in them to make the story worth continuing. And, similarly in sports, the villains who are the guys that we usually hate, not because they're bad players, but because they're good at certain things that make doing our job much harder. And that's what makes them fun to hate, is not that they're, like bad players or bad people, but because they deploy the dark arts against our team. And they're not supposed to do that because we're the good guys. So it's fun to think about villains in sports because they are, in a sense, so similar to a villain in sci-fi or in comics.
From a fiction point of view, how do you go about creating a villain? And then
what a question. Usually when you're creating a villain, you've created the hero first. So, for example, Batman probably has one of the most famous rogues galleries in all of comics. It's a rare thing in any kind of story that the villain can hold a story on their own. But, we all know who the Joker is. The Joker's had a couple of his own movies. We know who the Penguin is. The Penguin has his own series. We know who Poison Ivy is. And so usually you've set up a hero who has certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And what the villain's job then to do is exploit the weaknesses of the hero, which is exactly what happens on the pitch in soccer. The guys that we hate or love to hate are the guys who can effectively exploit our weaknesses. And that's what makes them so hateable. But if we're creating a new villain from scratch, usually what we'll do is sit down and think about, okay, what aspect of this story hasn't been told yet? If it's, again, to go back to the Batman example, his flaws are sort of that he operates in the shadows as well. He himself is kind of an anti-hero. He had everything, was born into luxury and had it all violently taken away. And so he has to, sort of operate outside the law in order to get it back and right the wrongs that have been done to him. So the anti-heroes or the villains that we create as foils have a very similar arc, so that on some weird level, we can relate to them and that the hero can relate as well. Because you're facing similar problems, but one character chooses to use a moral or a rational or, a sympathetic way to solve those problems. And another character, who is the villain, chooses the dark arts. They throw their morality out the window, or, they make choices that we know to be wrong, but their ends or their goals are often the same. And sort of that's what holds our interest is that we're sort of talking about solving the same problem in two different ways. One, which is, we hope just merciful, moral in some way that tries to be fair. And another one that is not concerned with fairness, not concerned with morality, not concerned with any of that stuff, just wants the shortest route to the result that they desire. I think the best villains are evenly matched with the heroes. So it's never quite clear who's going to win. So for your Superman, you need a Lex Luthor. He's super smart. He's got all this money. He's really ambitious. He's one step ahead. And so we don't know in any given conflict who's going to win. And if the bad guy does win, we're not that mad because it's a good character. And I think that's what makes the best villains, is that we root against them, but we're also kind of glad they're there. We're glad to fight them and not somebody else.
So what you're saying is for every Ozzy Alonso, you need a Diego Chara.
That's exactly right. That's it.
It is interesting. Just the more I thought about this topic, getting ready for the episode, coming more to the idea that maybe because soccer is increasingly so, an entertainment content is not the right term, but it is much more akin to wrestling than it is necessarily to like a superhero series, that the villains are maybe not so much villains as they are heels, that it's all broadly the same guys. It's just that they're doing it to the guys that you like. And in that way, maybe it's also not totally dissimilar from like an 80s teen movie where the villain is, they might do some things that you don't like, but really it's that they stand between the protagonist and their end goals. And so, we're going to do the time-honored tradition of all fandoms and remember some guys in a little bit, but some of them are not necessarily there are definitely practitioners of the dark arts on this list, but some of them are just guys who are good and play for not the Sounders. And that makes them villains. And in the same way, Paul Rothrock and Christian Roldan and Ozzy Alonso, two non-Sounders fan bases, are the villains when they take the field against whatever unfortunate team those fans might support.
Like Sporting Kansas City.
Well, this is another topic that I think is worth exploring in that, the purpose of an antagonist or an anti-hero in a story is to create tension and force the hero to overcome adversity and roadblocks in pursuit of their goals. And that keeps you engaged and it makes it more broadly appealing. And similarly, especially a league like MLS that wants to increase its followership and its viewership, you need that tension and antagonism between teams week in and week out, because it's not enough to just have the diehard fans of each team. You need neutrals and you need something that they can sink their teeth into. And so you have teams that are villains. And sometimes it's just that it's LAFC or the Galaxy or Miami, and they have resources that other teams might not, either don't have or are not bringing to bear, or it's Sporting Kansas City, a team of professional wrestling enthusiasts, or, Minnesota United playing haramball, as people have taken to referring to it. Hearing someone ask Brian Schmetzer about haramball remains one of the funniest things I have ever encountered in my life, by the way.
I don't think I listened to that press conference. I'm going to go back and look at it now.
It was someone asking a question who was not familiar with the background of the phrase. And so it wasn't Brian that got asked. It was Albert Rusnak got asked about haramball. But the pronunciation of haramball was odd, and I don't think Rusnak is online enough to have encountered that
in the wild
term in the wild. So he was just very confused. But
poor Albert.
That it is sort of, a team approaching the game in a way that is very steeped in the dark arts and contrary to how most people believe that the game should be played or how they enjoy watching it. And so you have these teams that become adversaries as well, just broadly making the entire league more exciting and fun to watch. It really gives you something to tune into when the Sounders aren't playing.
Yeah, I think without those rivalries, you don't have storylines. And one of the most interesting things to me coming into soccer kind of cold, not really being a sports person much before that, was that broadcasters and sports journalists will talk about storylines using that word. I was like, oh my God, they're talking about it like fiction. And that was really fascinating to me. And it's for all the reasons that you just said. Like there are not just a couple of evenly matched teams. You're not playing against the computer. It's not like, Oregon Trail or, computer chess or something where it's a faceless opponent who's just running some algorithms and spitting out the strategy that's most likely to win. It's human personalities and, it's different ways of approaching the game. And you sometimes encounter either players or entire teams whose philosophy about soccer is so different that it drives you nuts, like the Jose Mourinho's, where you want to play this high pressing, fast tiki-taka type of ball. And this other team is just bunkering in and being like, we'll let you kick the ball around for 45 minutes. That's totally fine. And, you're sitting up there and you can see that this is a very effective strategy to deploy against a team like that. But it's boring as hell and it's frustrating. And you're like, oh my God, why won't you people just play the ball the way I think you should play ball? And, and that's what gives us the drama, is having personalities and dynamism and, like people you kind of love to hate because they've got your number, like they know what strategy you're going to deploy and they know exactly how they're going to counter it. And a lot of the time it works. And then you're like, God, I hate those guys. And you don't hate them because they're evil. You hate them because they're winning. And it just, and it creates storylines exactly like you would have in fiction, which is awesome.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't have a moment in this conversation of at least some level of self-reflection about the club that we support and its place in MLS culture as the new pretty boys on the block 15 years ago, coming in, winning the Open Cup right away, almost winning 4 of those in a row. And then, infamously chanting, "You don't like us and we don't care." Also winning an MLS Cup without taking a shot on goal, just kind of like the Sounders have a very villainous role in MLS lore. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
I really didn't appreciate how hated, I'm just going to use the word hated, the Sounders are in so many other quarters of MLS until I'd been watching MLS for about maybe a season and a half. I'm like, wow, they really do kind of hate us out there. Why do they hate us so much? I think, one of the things that I love about this club, and I say this with no irony whatsoever, is that we are very high on our own supply. You need that. You really do need that. And it reminds me in a lot of ways of diehard comic book fans who love a certain character or a certain set of characters, and they've been following them for years and they're super invested, and it almost doesn't matter what those characters do. They're just in it. They're in it to win it. They love these people. They're insufferable online. And you're like, my God, you guys need therapy. We're kind of those guys. We need the therapy. Because, and I think it's not unwarranted. We talk a lot about the culture of the Sounders, about, built, not bought, all of this stuff. We're very proud of it. We have a lot of moral clarity about our ideals, which to us is part of what makes following this team and supporting this team so fun, is because it really does feel like a unified fan base, like we're all kind of on the same page, and not just about the football itself, but about who we are as people, what we represent in terms of our city and this region. And that, I can imagine, if you're outside of it, it really is. I mean, insufferable is a good word. You're like, oh my God, will you guys shut up about how wonderful you are and how great this club is? So I can see why it is annoying if you're not us. But, that's, again, that's storytelling. You need people, and you need clubs and personalities and people all across that sort of quadrant of lawful good, chaotic good, lawful evil, neutral evil, all of this stuff. And we're sort of, I think, way, way up in the, no, some people might disagree, but, I would put the Sounders quite firmly in the lawful good sort of category, which to everybody else is annoying as hell. But, that's Superman. That's sort of the Boy Scout.
I think it's annoying to them because they know we're right.
I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, let's tell ourselves that. Let's go with that. That sounds good.
I mean, not to get too into other soccer cultures and whatnot, but being a Liverpool fan feels very similar in the sense of like, there is a moral clarity there, and there's history behind that and stuff. And that's for, let's say, the Liverpool podcast I start some other time. But it's like, I'm sure I don't know which English club you support, but I'm sure hearing that
Wolves, we're going to get relegated in record time. It's just so sad. We won't talk about the Wolves.
I was going to say, maybe even you just hearing me say that about Liverpool, you had the same kind of grating heartburn that maybe other MLS supporters have when we talk about this.
Liverpudlians do seem also, likewise quite high on their own supply. But in the case of Liverpool, also, I don't know that it's unwarranted. I don't mind them. I don't mind them so much because Liverpool fans are dedicated. They're dedicated, and there's certain other clubs. I don't want to piss anybody off. That seem kind of put together in a hurry with a lot of money from dubious sources. There will always be bandwagoners who jump on when people start doing really well. And it just seems very artificial and plastic. And Liverpool is not one of those. So I don't mind that as much as I mind certain other clubs. Let's put it that way.
Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Well, this is a total aside, but as you two were talking, was struck with a bolt of lightning in the realization that Wilfried Nancy should not come back to MLS. He should coach Wolves when they go to the championship.
I would be so hyped for that. I would buy whatever ridiculous cable add-on I have to buy to watch the championship, because that would be incredible. That would be incredible. Yeah, but again, this is also part of storytelling when there's a falling out or, you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. That was Wolves with Nuno Espiritu Santo, who is a genius coach. And then, so to let him go and then go into this free fall is in itself a very good bit of storytelling, even if it is extraordinarily painful to watch as a fan, because that's FAFO, that's getting your comeuppance.
Yes. And all of Sunderland Till I Die is made better by how Sunderland is doing.
Oh my God. Yes. That is, so me and another comic book writer were talking about Sunderland Till I Die because not having anything to do with sports, but because it is so difficult to tell a compelling story about failure. That's one of the hardest things to do in storytelling. And they did it in Sunderland Till I Die. You see this club collapsing, but I'd watch 3 more seasons. In fact, I hope that they're now making, the season of resurrection where everything comes good and, the light dawns and we're back on top. So yeah, it really is incredible how much sports lends itself to those classic 3-act structures, villains, heroes, you fail, you have to learn these difficult lessons, but then you pull yourself up, you learn the lessons and everything comes around again. And you're like, yeah, maybe the reason we love sports so much is because that happens on a regular basis. Whereas in real life, it often feels like the bad guys win pretty consistently.
Speaking of bad guys that win consistently, speaking of stories that happen in 3 acts in terms of biting people, I think we should start with our Remembering Some Guys segment, talking about maybe the villain that is the most recent to Sounders lore, and that's Luis Suarez. What makes him an interesting villain to you?
Well, the funny thing about Luis Suarez is that, unless you are a longtime diehard fan of the teams he happens to have played for, everybody hates that guy. And maybe even some of the fans of the teams that he's been on also hate that guy. He's kind of a natural irritant, he's one of these dudes who is really good at what he does, but was not born to be a hero. He just takes to the villain role so well. And, it's also unfortunate that he chooses to deploy his most striking physical characteristic in that particular way. I mean, if you have these quite beautiful but prominent, shiny chompers, I would think that the last thing you would want to be known for is biting a bunch of people. I would think that you would choose something else. Maybe you'd break some ankles, maybe you'd do dirty tackles or fouls, but no, the man bites people.
Luis Suarez is, as I was contemplating this question, one of the defining characteristics that I came to in what makes a villain is the idea of a pursuit of power or success at all costs, regardless of the repercussions. And he, like, that going hand in hand with the limits that you have to push yourself to not only become a professional soccer player, but to become broadly one of the 5-10 best strikers that's played the modern game. Like, to reach that absolute pinnacle of performance and accomplishment, for like the constant tension you have to be under, the limits that you have to push yourself to, that even just, I know if I am having to push myself to accomplish the normal mundane things that I need to accomplish, if I go beyond a certain threshold, my barrier in emotional regulation is much thinner, and you start to see how committing a red card handball offense to deny a goal in the World Cup seems like the obvious choice. Not that it becomes justifiable, but you can see how a 20-year-old kid disrespecting you and your teammates results in a literal fight at Lumen Field where you spit on a 60-plus-year-old retired cop. Like, it is.
That was wild to see that in person. I was like, I can't believe I'm watching. I mean, it is like, it's like seeing a Lex Luthor in the flesh. You're like, oh my God, he's doing the thing. He's doing the thing he's famous for. I can't believe this is really happening.
I had been posting for like a year about how I wanted, Miami to go to the playoffs because that was the place where we were most likely to see a, in all caps, true Luis Suarez moment. And so to finally see it happen in the flesh, being up in the press box where everyone is on their computer reviewing fan videos like it's the Zapruder film, was a true delight. Going a little bit back in the MLS villainy archives, but still relatively modern. As I was coming up with a list of players, the Galaxy certainly have had a fair number, and two very different in so many ways, but both, I think, equally villainous characters. Robbie Keane and Zlatan Ibrahimovic really stand out. I know Keane's time was before you started following, correct? But
yeah, you guys would have more specific beef with him.
That man is a tiny somersaulting nightmare. But one of the prime examples that stands in my mind is, I think it was a playoff game between the Sounders and the Galaxy, and Adam Johansson, the Sounders right back, was tracking him just inside the box. Robbie Keane was on the left wing near the end line. Adam Johansson is just inside the box and is in a running motion, and Keane intentionally picks out Johansson's dangling hand and just flicks the ball up into it to win a penalty.
Wow.
Immaculate practitioner of the dark arts and a true villain. I am curious if there are any particular villains that have stood out to you or resonated in any particular way since you have started following.
I have to say that the first time I felt real, genuine on-site hatred for someone who had no direct relevance to my own life was when Tim Malia chokeslammed Christian Roldan. And, his head was inches from the crossbar. Is it a crossbar when it's on the ground? Anyway, from the crossbar of the goal. And I was like, my God, like 2 inches to the other side. And like, that's a head wound, like that you could have killed him. And I mean, I was on my feet freaking out and being like, I can't flipping believe this. You literally choke slammed a player. And, of course at the time, and this is another way that I think we tell ourselves our own stories in our heads. At the time, I did not notice or care that Christian was in fact encroaching on the goalie. When I calmed down and I rewatched, I was like, yeah, he should not have been there. But oh my God, I was incensed. I was really incensed. I was like, how in a professional setting do you do that to a person? And then the reaction of the fans of, the Club of Professional Wrestling Enthusiasts and MLS and, actual professional wrestlers on Twitter. If Tim Malia and Sporting Kansas City are in fact cursed, I was one of the people doing the cursing because, oh my God, I was so mad. And, I think it's one of those things where it really doesn't matter what the turnover is at that team after that. It doesn't matter who comes in and who goes out. You just always have this feeling going forward that those are the bad guys. Those are the guys on your shit.
SKC have been the bad guys for a long time.
That's fair.
Jimmy Nielsen.
Benny Feilhaber, Johnny Russell, Dom Dwyer.
Oh, Johnny Russell.
Roger Espinoza.
Oof. Johnny Russell is one of those guys who I think if he was a sounder, we would love him. That's one of those sort of, depends on your perspective ones where it's like, we hate him, but if he was a sounder, we'd all be getting his shirts. I feel that way.
I mean, we had Clint Dempsey, so
yes, yep, absolutely.
Clint Dempsey.
Speaking of, is he a hero or is he a villain, depending on your perspective? Clint Dempsey is probably you could write a whole thesis on how he's perceived by the people who he plays for versus, the people who support the teams he plays against.
I'm curious at this point in the conversation to kind of go back to the first question I asked you about like creating a villain. Villains aren't necessarily just people who do bad things. There's motive and context and stuff behind it. And I'm curious about kind of what creates a sports villain. And I think there's a situation in kind of Sounders lore that I believe was before your time. The Brian Mullen tackle on Steve Zakuani
was before my time, and I'm glad because I mean, everybody who saw that sounds legitimately like they have PTSD.
Yes, I was at the game and it was terrifying. However, I don't think I'm really impressed. And that was early on in my fandom. I was just really impressed how Sounders fans in general handled that situation with a lot of class and respect. And, Brian Mullen, his life changed in that moment too, not just Steve Zakuani's.
Absolutely.
So, I don't want to try to twist any words here. I don't think Brian Mullen is a villain, but I'm curious just about that maybe dichotomy between like players that are able to do bad things in moments, whether on purpose or on accident, like a situation like that, versus Luis Suarez, who is just always going to the next bad thing that he does. And I'm curious, like, what you think.
Well, you bring up something interesting. Not everybody who does something bad in a story is a villain. There's plenty of drama in ordinary people or people who are even trying to be good, who are making an effort to be one of the good guys, either screw up or there's, some sort of misunderstanding, some sort of, wires get crossed, messages are not received. And that is the difference between, I think, a story about a villain and a tragedy. A tragedy is when we don't mean for something bad to happen and it happens anyway. The good guy goes, or even the anti-hero goes to, you know, like avenge his dead partner or whatever, and he accidentally shoots the bad guy's girlfriend instead of the bad guy. You know, like there's stuff like that all the time. And that's sometimes more powerful than somebody who's just, you know, shithousing and we know wants to do something bad and succeeds in doing something bad. So, you know, like it's good to hear, especially when it's your fandom, whether it's of a fictional hero or a real life sports team, that people can tell the difference, you know, like that there's a difference between someone who is out to hurt a guy, like one would argue Tim Malia was doing with Christian Roldan, versus a mistimed tackle or a bad angle, or the field was slick, or the sun was in your eyes and you're like, oh my God, what have I done? And now you have to live with the guilt of having done this terrible thing that you didn't mean to do. So, you know, to me, that's just a very different kind of story. You know, like that's a tragedy. And you're right. You know, both players' lives changed in that moment. And I wouldn't want to be either one of them in that scenario.
I think with the Brian Mullen, Steve Zakuani incident, and we were just talking about Tim Malia, the real difference in those moments is how the individuals chose to respond and react to the incident, where I think realistically, both moments are a player caught in the heat of the moment, reacting outside of their, you know, usual behavior. Brian Mullen mistimes a tackle. It's a bad tackle. It's a retaliatory tackle. It causes a horrifying injury. And he like took steps to make amends. Tim Malia, he and his entire team and then the league reveled in this moment. You know, SKC later in the season celebrated a Johnny Russell goal with a choke slam goal celebration. Like they reveled in this heel moment. And I think it is, you know, particularly as a team who has been, often is seen as the villains, and oftentimes for good reason, that you get to choose whether you are the hero or villain, really based on how you respond.
100%, because the way that you respond shows how you are processing what happened on an ethical level. You know, because you have a choice. You can be like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. I'm so sorry. Oh, you know, like this is going to haunt me. Or you could be like, I'm going to dance on your grave. I'm going to do like a mocking chokeslam celebration. You know, I'm going to do hilarious Twitter posts and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, like that's where the temperature check is really, is in the response. And because that shows everybody around you, you know, what your thinking is, not just the action itself, but what did you mean to do? And even if you didn't mean it, how are you interpreting your own actions? And, you know, sometimes that's what defines a hero versus a villain. You know, not that a hero never does anything bad, but how does the hero respond when he or she has done something bad, you know, either by accident or by tragedy or fate. So yeah, that was wild.
Yes.
That was wild.
Well, I think the three of us probably could keep talking about this forever, just about, but I think this is a good place to call it. Willow, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, you know, the next year involves our heroes conquering all of the villains that they face.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. We've been independent since August of 2023, but need your support to make sure it continues. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible by your continued support. Memberships start as low as $25 a year, which not only helps make podcasts like this one happen, but also gets you access to everything we produce. If you're able to support us at higher levels, starting at $75 a year, you gain access to a host of other perks, most notably entry into our members-only Discord, where the smartest, funniest, and most engaged commenters share their thoughts and ideas. To find out more, just visit sounderatheart.com and click the subscribe button in the top right corner. Thanks for listening.
Howdy, folks. I'm Mark with Backpost Runners, joined here with Tim, also from Backpost Runners. But more importantly, we're joined by the Guardians, Jeff Reuter, to talk to us about MLS Rivalries. Jeff, first and foremost, congratulations on your new position. And second, thanks for joining us.
Of course, you're welcome, I guess, is what they teach you. And it always seems so abrasive to "you're welcome" someone, right? Like it's like you better be thankful. That one falls off the etiquette cue, but thank you for the congratulations all the same.
It does fit nicely into a very British idea of politeness, so I think that's appropriate.
I guess, right? It's like it's also like I don't want this little moment of satisfaction to end, right? And so I'm going to make it linger for 2 more sentences before you can change topics, which we're doing really well on this episode already. So hijacking your podcast for etiquette lessons, that's what I'm here for, personally.
Hey, that's very British of you. So there we go.
So is The Guardian, I guess. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with Jeff and his work, Jeff has been covering American soccer for a decade plus. Is that accurate to say? And
it is.
Has had previous stops at we don't have to name them, but nationwide publications that you are probably very familiar with as a listener. We wanted to have Jeff on the show today because I think one, Jeff is a close friend of mine, but 2, I think he has a very interesting perspective in terms of where MLS rivalries are at right now as, we enter the 2026 MLS season. I had to write that down because the year doesn't feel real. And for whatever reason, something about this season just feels off. And I think part of the reason why it feels off is we're about 1.5 years away from the biggest shift that MLS has kind of ever done in terms of they're shifting their schedule around. And part of that shift is some conference realignment. And so what I wanted to do to start this conversation was just kind of open it up and ask you an open-ended question in terms of what do you think of the coming conference alignment? And more importantly, what does that mean for games and fans of teams that just exist in this liminal space of there's a season that's going to happen. There's going to be a smaller season that happens after that.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for them to pull it off, which is a very Midwestern way of saying I don't quite get it. Because what you're looking at with the calendar change, and a lot of this has been driven by sporting rationale. The idea being that Major League Soccer can be a more relevant competitor in the global transfer market, get better players at more opportune times of their contracts, have these negotiations when it's not, for example, you're selling your best player in the summer to a team in Europe who's in their off season, but you're in the middle of your, push for a supporters shield or an open cup or MLS cup. And now suddenly you're trying to picture life without your star player, right? This has been untenable for a lot of different players and teams over the years. And so the idea is that you need to make this change. The timing of it is suspect though, because right now what you have, as you've alluded to, is 1 more year of this normal look, but it's going to be very different because of the World Cup in North America. And then there's going to be the sprint season at the start of 2027. And so I think that I maybe didn't appreciate that 25 was probably the final, normal first version of MLS schedule season that we will get. And from here on, it's just going to feel like a period of transition. Now, what does that mean for fans of their teams? From what I can tell, I think they'll just keep showing up. I think that some fans have been excited that more of their summer weekends will be open to do different things than watch MLS every single weekend. I think that there are also others who will say, actually having the entire season run parallel to the school year is not going to be good for their consumption of Major League Soccer, right? And that's fair too. And I think that both sides of that will continue to sort of voice their opinions on it. But I don't know. I mean, it's just like, it's a very transitional sort of period for MLS, but I will admit, I think I've lost sight of where they're trying to park this bus. At this point, it's just kind of still in motion. And so a lot of this is wait and see. And I think that for MLS, the one benefit is so many of their fans are team specific, right? Like it's very rare to find that sicko who is like, I could tell you the starting left back on all 30 MLS teams or all 15 teams in the conference that my team plays in even, right? And so in that sense, it doesn't really matter when you hold the games, because what's going to matter is, for a Seattle fan, when do we play Portland? When do we play competitive rivals like LAFC and the Galaxy? When do we play Vancouver? These sorts of things. And that's just looking at a schedule. That's not necessarily what month did that fall in. And so I think a lot of that is still to be determined whether or not it's better for the fan experience as they change the calendar.
Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Just additionally, from a transfer perspective, I think part of the hope is in being able to attract higher level talent and less frequently lose your top level talent in the middle of the season. If you are a team who's going out and picking up players out of Europe, often it's either you pick them up in the summer in the middle of your season and they end up oftentimes with sort of a lost half of a season where they don't acclimate because they're in preseason until the last few weeks, or you pick them up in the winter and now you have a person who has likely at the end of that season been going nonstop for 18 plus months. And, you know, aligning in that way hopefully allows players to transition into the league a little bit more smoothly. Just a little added piece of that.
And I think that makes it better for the fan, by the way. It's just like when a signing comes in, if they need 6 months to figure out, okay, so how does the kid get to school? Where is the school? Where's the training ground? Why am I driving on the left side of this vehicle? Whatever the case may be, like, I mean, like, of course, they're not going to be performing at their best, right? And so, like, I think more fans want to see something closer to what we saw with Son Heung-min and LAFC or Thomas Muller to a degree with Vancouver. Now, granted, both of them hadn't played nearly as much as they had for most of their careers in their final year with Tottenham and Bayern Munich, respectively. But yeah, I think you're right. I think being able to get players at a better time is going to help because, part of the preseason is you look at the schedule and you say, okay, look, this is load management stuff, right? At the beginning of the season, we're trying to get everyone ramped up. We're going to do some more rotation and figure it out. The first 10 games don't really affect whether or not you're able to make the playoffs. Just ask 2023 Sporting Kansas City, who got 3 points in 10 games and still won a first round series in the playoffs, right? Like you don't need to worry about those so much. What you do need to worry about new signing is this game in April at Providence Park. That's the first time where you're really going to have that sort of check-in where the fans are saying, like, do you have the sauce? Are you going to add something to this team? Do you fit into the culture of this? Are you helping raise the floor of our performances? So even when we're in these ugly, cagey games that the Sounders and Timbers have gotten themselves into for the better part of half a decade now, are you going to change that? Are you going to elevate what that experience looks like? And so, like, for the central thrust of the episode, like, that is relevant. Like the ability to actually project how these players will fit into the rivalries, how you paid so much money in the transfer fee and the salary that you may be expecting them to be one of your 2 or 3 best players. But if they're gassed because they've been going for 18 months in a row, or the other side, if you think of someone like Sergio Reguilon, who signed with Inter Miami this offseason, well, he hasn't played since like May. And even then, he was like the 4th string left back on Tottenham as they won the Europa League. He was barely playing games. And so for him, it's 8 months where they do need this time to be able to ramp him back up, right? So you'll avoid a lot of these situations. It'll be, like I still have my issues just in terms of like MLS Cup being played in the spring, I think feels very different than MLS Cup being played in December just for aura purposes and just sort of like the whatever. But just generally, I think it is a direction the league wanted to go into. It's interesting, again, Midwestern term, that the Players Association has not yet authenticated the calendar switch. I saw that reported by Jeff Carlisle of ESPN, on the day we're recording this, that, the Players Union has not yet said, sure, let's change the schedule. And so, we'll see. I'm sure that at that point, though, that's posturing and that's saying, okay, our players are generally on board, but what's in it for us? And is it image rights getting a little boost to that? Is it going to be compensation, salary cap, what have you? But that's not why we're here today, I don't think.
I mean, maybe we'll have an episode in the future about salary cap stuff, but it's not interesting to me right now. No. What is interesting to me, and I'm very curious what your opinion of the situation is at least, I'm one Sounders fan that has a perspective, although I know that this perspective is permeating throughout the fan base, and that is the Cascadia rivalries with Portland and Vancouver have become stale in general, mostly due to the fact that there's just been a lot of games. And it just is just kind of feeling like it's just not what it was 10 years ago or 8 years ago, so like, I think maybe the height of the rivalry is that playoff series on where it goes to the penalty shootout at Lumen Field on a Thursday night during a car show. Like that has a lot of mystique. And basically ever since then, we've just been kind of lame. Like they've just been really boring games. The Sounders basically never win at home anymore when they play the games. And it's just kind of boring. I'm curious about your perspective on Cascadia from an outsider's perspective, but also Sounders fans don't get the opportunity to really kind of delve into other rivalries. So is there another premier rivalry in MLS? So first question, obviously, your thoughts on Cascadia. Second question, as a follow-up, what's kind of taken its throne, so to speak?
Yeah, I like the framing of that too, because I think that it is worth starting by saying it wasn't just localized attention that made it feel like Cascadia, specifically talking Seattle and Portland, obviously, was the preeminent sort of rivalry in Major League Soccer of the 2010s. I'll go ahead and give them the decade. That's great. They get the 2010s. And you could see it because it was the emergence of MLS's fan culture and the idea that each of these teams would have their own identities that was led by supporters. You would have these elaborate TIFO. And then, of course, that became problematic because the TIFO then were the thing that the league was using for the marketing without, actually really acknowledging the fact that that's fan made and not just like part of MLS stadiums that's built in with the concrete, right? You also have very good players. You have a stretch where from 2015 to 2020, check my math, every single Western Conference MLS Cup 21. It was through 21, right? It was like a 7-year stretch where it was either going to be Seattle or Portland making it into MLS Cup pretty much. And so that has fallen off. I will say, and I'm not just saying this because I recognize the affinity of both of y'all, it takes two to tango. And the Portland Timbers have not been operating with the same level of ambition or competitiveness since probably 2021 as they were in the 2010s. There has been a major difference under the fact that they're still owned by Merritt Paulson and that there are changing politics in the MLS landscape around Merritt Paulson, to say nothing of Gavin Wilkinson, who was, such a sporting figure or a key figure in the sporting department. He wasn't sporting necessarily in the adjective sense for the Timbers. And then you look at, Savarese leaving, and then you have a very different sort of approach to coaching, if you can call it that, from Phil Neville, right? Who openly admits that he doesn't really feel like it's the job of a coach to really coach all the time, right? And so it's been a very different sort of feel to it, where Portland has been one of the most inconsistent teams in Major League Soccer in the 2020s, in the sense where they are as likely to put up a 4-1 win as they are to lose by 7 at home, right? So you get to these games then where the two teams face off. And for Portland, that is where they show, no, we still have the culture. We still have Soccer City. We still want to be one of the forerunners of the Western Conference. And so we are going to put everything we have into that game. For Seattle, we can't mess this one up. We know that for the 2020s, we have been a more competitive team than the Timbers. So we need to be able to show up and we need to stop them at whatever they're going to be trying to pull. And it just creates this sort of cagey, almost dull. It doesn't help that lately both teams are having to wear secondary jerseys either, and part of it is color contrast, right? Like green and green is not great on the eyes if you're trying to pick it apart, but one of them in green and the other one having to wear something else. Sometimes that's like a badge of honor when you think of like a Manchester United versus Liverpool rivalry where both teams wear red. If you're having to force them into their greens, you have the advantage. You're the red team on the field, right? And sometimes these things matter, especially to fans more than players, obviously, unless you really don't recognize who you're passing to, unless you're wearing your primary shirt. When you look at what's changed in the 2020s, MLS has expanded so much that I think that the league has had a lot of opportunity for more organic rivalries. And in the past, and maybe this is better for a separate topic, but in the past, they would really push rivalry week. And the idea was that every team will find you a rival. Minnesota United, welcome to Major League Soccer. I'm based in Minnesota, right? And I remember that they were really trying to force Sporting Kansas City as a rival for Minnesota United. And it just didn't work because there wasn't reason. There wasn't like that sort of classic game that then, the rematch was going to have heightened stakes and thereafter could carry on. They weren't even really competing at the same point of the table because Minnesota's rise to being competitive sort of, perfectly intersected ships in the night with Peter Vermees sort of falling off with Sporting Kansas City around 2019, 2020. So when you get to the league at a whole, right now, the best rivalry is hell is real. Like if you're just going to like try to get some general soccer fan to watch Major League Soccer and you just had to pick one matchup and you are like 99% confident this isn't going to backfire and you're going to get a good atmosphere, you're going to get a good game, tensions will be like palpable from watching at home, you would show them Cincinnati versus Columbus at either of their stadia. It helps that they both play in very good modern soccer specific stadiums. It helps that they have very disparate identities in the sense where they can always be wearing their primary kits against each other. So you're just used to it looking a certain way. It helps that they're winning trophies this decade. Cincinnati, just the Shield so far. Columbus, just the Cup so far. But they're contending for more, right? And so I think that is what you look at. And so what's different from that to Cascadia? I mean, some of it's just, it's new. And people just like something that is new. If you're watching at a national level, if you're just like a neutral who it's rivalry week again, because rivalry week shows up 3 times a year still, or 2 times a year. I have to watch if you're saying I have to watch one game, I think people are switching over to the Ohio rivalry rather than the Northwest. And some of that, I think you laid it out really well. I think some of that is just tense matchups, and at a certain point people know what to expect.
Do you think it has anything to do with the Apple TV of it all? Like all the games are on at the same time, and for the most part the Seattle game is going to be on at 10:30 Eastern. It doesn't help. It doesn't help any team on that side. Like I think El Tráfico is going to be the one that people are wondering why I didn't pick that, right? And I think that sometimes El Tráfico is it's a different sort of sideshow in its own way. I think that is a game that doesn't resemble soccer more consistently than any other matchup I see, where there's just weird stuff and it's entertaining. You'll get Zlatan, just kind of doing like side volleys on his debut from 70 yards out and scoring or whatever, right? Like it's a great spectacle, but it's also been so feast or famine, where the Galaxy have been competitive for like 2 years of LAFC's history, pretty much 23 and 24 when Ricky Puig was healthy. So it does make it tricky when the teams are at an imbalance, to go back to the Seattle and Portland sort of comparison of this decade. Apple TV also, look, it's not a hot take to say right now they're not interested in pairs of teams facing each other. They're interested in one team
right? And so much of their interest, and part of this is the global audience, right? And they do actually like serve a properly global audience, over 100 nations of subscribers. Obviously not the entire nation, but people across the world want to watch Lionel Messi. It makes sense. They might want to watch Sung Hyung-min too. They might want to watch Thomas Muller, a handful of other players, but they're really glomming on to Miami. And it'll be interesting to see if that continues now that the Suarez and Busquets and Alba won't be that sort of like it's Barcelona a decade ago and you miss the 2010s. So watch your favorite team from the 2010s, right? But right now it is hard for another team that isn't wearing hair in pink to get a word in edgewise right now in their broadcasts. It's very difficult for matchups outside of the Eastern time zone to really get much of the focus, because they are building their pregame shows around the first set of kickoffs. And so then they're trying to kind of fit a 15-minute preview of the late, Pacific time zone kickoffs right after doing a recap of the East and while they're concluding the Central and the Mountain time zone games. So like there just isn't time to really build up a lot of those Western Conference kickoffs. So yeah, I suppose that I would say that some of this does come down to Apple TV and the way that they've generated it, where it is just constant and it is concurrent, it's overlapping, and it's really difficult to pick up individual games from the pile that they've sort of assembled on Saturday nights lately.
The Apple TV aspect is obviously relevant for like neutrals and more macro view of things, but looking ahead a little bit to the conference realignment that is going to be happening with the calendar switch, it has focused a lot on the regional rivalries, which is not the only kind of rivalry you have. I mean, the Sounders have a long-standing rivalry with Sporting Kansas City. There is, to less of an extent, one with RSL. Like, rivalries are not strictly based on your closest proximate neighbor.
Right.
But Mark had mentioned earlier some of what caused the staleness in the Sounders Timbers rivalry is that they just played each other so much. And some of that is a product of the way Open Cup is structured and that you are regionally grouped there. And so for a long time, it was the two MLS meetings a season, plus you were for sure going to play each other in Open Cup. And then maybe in the playoffs, you would meet. Looking back, since the Timbers entered MLS, the two teams have played each other just twice in a season, 3 times. One of those was the first season. The other two were in 2022 and this season. Every other season, it is 3+ times. Some of those, it's as many as 5. I have to imagine that has played a factor in some of the other like regional rivalries. Do you have a sense that it just has kind of become, even in those individual fan bases, a little bit tired of, God, we're going to have to see, with the Northeast teams, are New England and DC going to have to play again?
Yeah. I think that there is some fatigue there. And I think that you look at, the changing format of the Open Cup. This isn't a benefit, but this is just a change. You have fewer first teams competing in this tournament. So there's even a chance, like, for example, I think last year New York City entered its next pro team. So even if the bracket had given them the Red Bulls, well, okay, it's not really like the rules make it so you can't loan down Alonso Martinez and Matt Freese and 9 other of your starters to your next pro team. Like, the idea is if you're fielding a next pro team, it's a next pro team, right? And it should be reflective of your next pro roster and your schedule.
Right.
But you look at, some of those other regional ones, I think over time, the big one that was sort of highlighted was the Northeast-Southeast split of Philadelphia and DC, which was another rivalry that MLS sort of tried to manufacture, especially after New York City FC debuted in 2015, because the Red Bulls had generally been seen as DC's primary rival, right? Going back to Metro Stars days. And so splitting them into different conferences geographically is correct. I think it is also the reaction I tended to see from fans on both sides, Union fans, United fans, was that, yeah, it was not really a rivalry anymore. And I think that DC United fans would probably admit they haven't really played well enough to deserve a rival in a sense of like a competitive, these games matter and this is a trophy in its own right. I think that you would also throw in Copa Tejas as a really good example where you have 3 teams in Texas, and yes, there's San Antonio FC, and in the past there was a team in Austin in the USL and other USL teams in Texas that haven't stuck around in Oklahoma, but they will play each other over and over and over again in these competitions. If you get to California, these teams will play each other. Rocky Mountain Cup, I think, is overplayed a little bit right now with Colorado and RSL. That's just a reality of how the schedule works and how regionalized the draw is. The reality is a regionalized draw doesn't really benefit MLS teams so much as the lower division team. So you do need to have it for the Open Cup. But when you get into things like the Leagues Cup, when you get into things like whatever they're going to do with the sprint season schedule, I would imagine it will be very tailored towards regionalized games. And the idea of trying to build some of these groups out so that people have familiarity. That's what I would do, at least, is I would try to make sure that, for example, you have the one hodgepodge division that has teams from the East and the West. And it's Minnesota, St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, Cincinnati, Columbus. It's a fun 6-pack of teams. But there's not a lot of interaction right now between Minnesota, St. Louis, Kansas City, and the Eastern group, which generally has performed a little bit better over the last few years, except for Chicago. So it's a good opportunity to sort of build up those synapses, make it feel sort of real, more real. And you can sort of project a little easier, like Kansas City and St. Louis, they'll be rivals because they already are. Cincinnati and Columbus, best rivalry in the league right now. So Minnesota and Chicago, well, at least they're in like the same division in every other American sport. So there is like these cities are used to being rival-ish. And so maybe this is an opportunity to be proper rivals. That's one that I would look at from this new alignment as like, almost ready-made. And then you have who is Nashville's biggest rivalry actually? Is it Atlanta? Is it Miami, who they keep face planting against, but they've been trying to go against? Is it Charlotte? Is it Orlando? Is it, there's a lot of potential there. So there is excitement, because I think at this point, the age of MLS tailoring its own rivalries has had to go for a while. And now we're finally able to figure out what are the new ones that aren't just so glaringly obvious, and the ones that are going to be maybe more intriguing as you're like, okay, I've watched a lot of Hell is Real. I've watched a lot of Rocky Mountain Cup, Cascadia, whatever, El Tráfico. Let's see what else is out there.
Nashville's biggest rival is Nashville versus me remembering they exist. So
that's totally fair.
I've got one last big open-ended question, and then we can end with a very specific one that I have. But I'm curious about this concept of born rivalries. So, for instance, I would say, historically speaking, the Sounders versus the Galaxy is a born rivalry because of the stakes at which they've met in various competitions and whatnot. So everybody, famously remembers the 2014 season where the Sounders beat the Galaxy on the final day of the season, which also happened to be my wedding day, to win the Supporter Shield. A few weeks later, the Galaxy come up to an icy cold Seattle and ping one off the post to win on aggregate. Or I think even back then it was away goals, right? And advance, and then they go on to win MLS Cup. Another born rivalry, or at least I don't even necessarily think it's a rivalry, but something that is special to the Sounders fans and even Toronto fans is obviously Seattle versus Toronto. They've met in 3 MLS Cups. So I'm curious if there are any interesting born rivalries across MLS right now that we're unaware of. And then I have a very secret question after that.
Exciting. And I didn't get the questions ahead of time, so they've all been secret questions. So if you're branding this as such, it's even more exciting for me personally. I think there's been a few in recent years, especially when you're looking at since crowds have been able to return from, let's say, 2022 onward, where you can kind of start to see the competition of MLS and its various subsidiary competitions that the teams play in have really fostered better matchups. I think that Nashville and Miami, for example, they debut together. This is like another one of those where it's kind of born rivalries, but it also is kind of manufactured. Expansion siblings. we saw so many of these from especially like 2011 onward, right? When you think of Vancouver and Portland joining together, Minnesota and Atlanta, New York City and Orlando. Nashville dominated Miami until Messi signed. And then from that Leagues Cup final in 2023, which was the first trophy in the first tournament Messi played in, that Miami won, they just cannot get close to Miami. Nashville has been so far behind. Now, they've made some really exciting moves. They made one of the best moves of the offseason so far by signing Christian Espinoza on a free agent contract after San Jose missed the deadline to pick up his option for 26, which, cost Chris Lee's job pretty obviously based on the press releases released by San Jose. But I think that's very much to Nashville's benefit. And I think that if they can win a meaningful game, I'm not necessarily talking about like week 12 or whenever they play each other in the regular season, but if they can win a playoff series, a playoff matchup, an Open Cup semifinal, whatever the case may be, that could do wonders for that rivalry to feel more tangible, maybe. I would also throw in Vancouver and LAFC, who played one of the best games of the postseason last year. When you look at that penalty kick shootout coming on the back of LAFC knocking Vancouver out of the first round in each of the previous two postseasons, I think that there's actually something meaningful and tangible there. And now, yes, you have Son and Mueller, and who knows how long the shelf life is on like trying to build these around players. And that's always been an issue of MLS's is like, oh, we have these star players that we brought in, so we're trying to kind of coast on the legacy of their previous clubs and their previous stops in their career internationally, whatever. And that doesn't always carry weight in the same way. I will say from the outside, but regionally inside, I definitely have seen more of this sort of animosity brewing between the Sounders and the Loons in recent years, sort of culminating in a 3-game ending in an instant classic sort of first round. And the hard part is these matchups are coming in the first round, and Minnesota hasn't done anything to meaningfully unseat Seattle as probably the best team of the last 10 years in the Western Conference, right? They lost the conference final against the Sounders, and that would be something you would say is necessary to have that effect. But you do see that with some of the tone, not just the coaches' press conferences, but, fans, interacting with each other on social. And we'll see how that changes now that Eric Ramsey is probably, if he's going to keep up with that ideology. West Brom is a club that was made for that ideology. Just feels like it's a Tony Poulos club. So
is Daryl DK still there?
Yeah. There's a few of them. And I think that skewed a little Western, but I think that we have started to see with more of these competitions being clear in the hierarchy of the Leagues Cup maybe isn't as big of a deal as the league was trying to push it to be in 2023. And so those results don't really play into this as well, but the playoffs ultimately are kind of where these sorts of things are really crystallized. And I think you've gotten some really good examples in recent years.
It is interesting that you brought up the Sounders Loons, because that was my secret question. And I was going to frame it around the concept of one-way rivalries, because that, again, from my one perspective as a Sounders fan, feels very one way. There's a lot of animosity coming from St. Paul, Minnesota West, but there's a lot of I don't even know who you are coming back east from Seattle, Washington. Or what's the Don Draper line? I don't think about you.
I don't even think about you. Yeah.
I don't think about you at all.
Yeah. So I was curious. I mean, you kind of already spoke about it, and you obviously live in Minnesota, so have a certain perspective. I also, at the time, I lived in Minnesota for 4 years, so I understand a little bit, but just quickly, I'm not sure if there are any other one-way rivalries that you are aware of currently, but that feels like maybe the chief among them.
It's certainly a prominent one. And this is where I'm going to kick it to the research that was done by Elliot McKinley in 2024 for American Soccer Analysis. A friend of mine did a simple 2-question survey that was filled out by 4 figures of MLS fans. It was number 1, who is your team? Number 2, who do you consider to be your biggest rival? and just an excellent concept, right? Because you ended up with this like delightful flow chart where it was like Minnesota generally said Kansas City, but Kansas City only said St. Louis, right? Okay, well, as we alluded to earlier, that rivalry was kind of dead. Vancouver said that Seattle was their biggest rival, but Seattle did not reciprocate that. So, okay, what does that mean? San Diego, before they'd even played a game, was like LAFC, and LAFC was like, I genuinely forgot San Diego got an MLS team until you start playing games, right? The other one-way rivalries, the Revs and the Union, the Revs see the Union as such, DC sees the Red Bulls as such. The one that really has confounded me, and I think that this is, I wonder how much of this is just like regionally. I've never lived in the Southeast. I don't know if you could tell by the anything about me that I've never lived in the Southeast, but I've had a lot of fun in a lot of cities in the Southeast, and I can't really figure out who Charlotte is like sizing up every single year. And it feels like Charlotte, and there's a running joke that Matt Doyle has been doing in his Substack for over a year now, where Charlotte gets a different team name every single installment, because Charlotte FC, it's just there isn't much of an identity around them. You don't really know who their rivals are. There aren't, frankly, they're playing in a stadium where it's not going to enhance the soccer experience, whether it's on the field with the quality of that turf or lack thereof, or it is the atmosphere of the Panther Stadium. Neither of these are really helping internally. But again, it's one of those where it's like, it's east and it's kind of southeast. And I think geographically you would say so as such, but it's not as southeast as Atlanta or Orlando or Miami. And so those clubs are kind of focused on each other. Nashville, I've spoken about maybe too much in this episode. And I just don't really know where that leaves Charlotte. Elliot's research found that Charlotte sees Atlanta as a rivalry and nobody sees them as a rival. And that maybe tracks. And there are at least three teams. Yeah. Orlando, which granted also sees Miami as such. But Orlando, Charlotte, Nashville all look at Atlanta that way, and Atlanta only looks at Orlando. So it's just kind of interesting. You see those teams that come in and just generally feel Atlanta kind of was the Galaxy after the Galaxy fell off, in the sense that that was the super team, the in vogue team, the team that everyone was kind of looking at, be like, yeah, I want to do what Tata Martino did in 2018, to the point that Atlanta is literally trying to do what Tata Martino did in 2018 and 2026 with a much older Miguel Almiron, and one of the worst transfer fees paid for a striker in MLS history, with Emmanuel Ladilath on $22 million. So it'll be very interesting to see. But I guess to put a bow on it, it's just, it gets frustrating when those rivalries aren't crystallized, because I think sometimes a rivalry should seem obvious, right? Like you should just be able to tell as soon as the whistle blows, because the crowd is so engaged. It's like, yeah, okay, they're really up for it this time. Or in the days and weeks leading up to it, you can pull together like a fantastic highlight package where no matter how many times you've watched these clips, you're going to watch it back, because it's how you want to watch the Sounders beat the Timbers, right? It's just, there's something in your brain that you react positively, and you watch these clips over and over and over again. And I think a lot of teams right now will feel they don't have that opponent. I would say that if you're being generous, I think you still have less than half of the 30-team league that is fully confident in who its primary rival is, right? I think it's truly 5 to 7, like crystallized rivalries. So will the schedule change help enable that? Probably not. Will the conference realignment change it? I think so. I think that's where you're kind of just going to have to cordon off, and you're in big groups of 6, and you've got to come up in 3 groups of 2 from there, and everybody do-si-do, right? Like it's just, you're going to have to eventually figure out who, and it might be the best of what's left around, but the alignment at least guides us to where some of these will be. And that's maybe an exciting evolution for MLS.
I think that's a great place to end it. It'll be exciting to watch how these rivalries change and grow over this season and the next several. This has been Backpost Runners. I am and will continue to be Tim. I've been joined by Mark and our illustrious guest, Jeff Reuter. We will see you all next time.